Hi, everyone. Whoa, this is loud. This is loud. All right. Hello, everyone, and welcome to this session about CSS for decoration. As Mike just introduced me, I am Razvan, and that's not scaled right. I'm Razvan. I work for Adobe with a bunch of awesome people to propose and implement new web standards, such as CSS Shapes, regions, masking, blend modes. But nowadays, I don't work on CSS anymore. I work with a team that does prototypes and tools for upcoming Adobe products. However, CSS is still something I'm very passionate about, and that's why I'm here to talk about this today. So there's one thing which kind of bugs me lately is that I see this trend of people trying to achieve something using only CSS, as if other web technologies out there aren't suitable for various things. And the thing which started me down this rabbit hole was this question on Stack Overflow. So this person here is asking if it's possible to achieve that background image without actually having to resort to downloading an image. And there's obviously a few solutions you could use for this. There's polygons. You can use a canvas. My solution didn't get picked. My solution didn't even get any upvotes. But it's not like I'm going to do an entire presentation in Poland just because I'm upset. Or am I? OK, so the questions about doing stuff only in CSS range from the very pertinent ones, like the previous one, to some more questionable ones, like this one. So this person wants to achieve this lemon shape in CSS and HTML. And I have to take note of the tone of this person. It's like, this shape, I want. Can it be done with CSS? Here, I created a circle. I would hate to be a person working under this person if this is a manager. But it doesn't hurt to actually ask questions. But the problem with this is that this is a perfect use case for SVG. However, most of the answers that the person got was something like this. There's somebody coming here and basically introducing a lot of empty HTML elements, and it's a very weird CSS that uses transforms and very specific interactions between properties and CSS. So it gets the job done. You get the lemon shape you want. But there's a problem with this sort of solutions. These solutions are the ones which rely on empty HTML elements and CSS side effects, they're very sensitive to context. They're very fragile. If anything else changes in your application, it's likely to influence your shape over there, because CSS wasn't meant for illustration, at least not in that scenario. But I'm not completely dissing people who are using CSS to achieve something remarkable. So there's this collection about illustrations created in a single HTML element using only CSS. It's a collection by Lynn Fisher, and I am very convinced that this was an amazing learning opportunity for her, and for me as well, because I read the code and I learned a few new things about CSS. But do I think these are good solutions for implementing them in production code? Not really, because they're very difficult to maintain. You yourself as a developer 6 months from now may probably not understand what's going on over there, because CSS wasn't made to do this. CSS, however, does have amazing features for decorations. And I can just mention gradients, filters, blend modes, shadows, borders, and whatnot. But time's short, so I'm just going to focus today on two: CSS gradients and background images. So here's what we're going to go over today. We're going to look at how we can create background shapes using CSS gradients. We're going to use this knowledge to create skeleton screens to improve perceived performance. And we're going to have a quick look at making borders behave better in browsers. So without further ado, let's get into CSS gradients. Many of you probably know how CSS gradients work. For those of you who don't, and for those of you who need a refresher, let's do a quick crash course in CSS gradients. So there's two types of gradients that we have spread across browsers implemented so far. The first one is the linear gradient, and you can probably see it up here on screen. So linear gradient is declared like this. It's distributing color across a line. And in this scenario, it's going from left to right. And I can change the angle of this line, also called the gradient line, by increasing and decreasing the angle over here. Oh, and by the way, I forgot to mention, this entire presentation is built in HTML and CSS, and this is all interactive code. So all that you see is what you get. This is actually working in browsers, and most of the things I'm going to show today work across all browsers, all modern browsers that you can use today. So I'm changing the code here, and that's changing the angle of the gradient. I'm just going to leave it at 120 because I like it. And the second part of the declaration here, these are called color stops. So I'm using named colors just so it's easier to follow along. But color stops basically mean where on the gradient line a color starts, and the other one, and the other, and so far. So we're going here from turquoise to some purple, and these values, 0% and 100%, are actually the default value. So you can actually remove these values, and you're still going to end up with the same element, the same gradient, because it's basically the default. You can actually change the position. Whoa, I shouldn't have done that. All right, let's try this again. I can change the position of that color on the gradient by increasing or decreasing the color stop position. So now I'm moving the turquoise up to 50%, and I can also reduce the purple down to 60. And here's something that happens really interesting when you get very, very close to matching color stops. You get a hard edge. This is a sudden jump in the gradient, and the browser basically will clamp the value to whatever it was before it. So it can actually go even lower than 50%, and you're not going to see any difference because the browser just takes the previous color stop and clamps the new value to that one. So often you'll see people do something like this. They're going to put a 0 at the end because that basically means I'm just going to clamp it to the previous value. And this gives you a bit more flexibility. So now if I increase the turquoise up and down, I don't have to change the value in 2 positions anymore. And I can obviously still use the gradient line and change it and get a different shape over here. Right. So these are linear gradients. Radial gradients are somewhat similar, but instead of having a line on which the gradient moves, you have what's called a gradient ray, or a virtual gradient ray, which emanates from a single point in all different directions. I'm going to start first off with the color stops because they work exactly the same way as with linear gradients. So we have turquoise going from 0 to 100%. I can increase this one to, say, 50% and decrease the other one down to 50 again. And again, we're going to get this nice clamped value over here. I can actually go to 0 because that makes it more flexible. Now, the scaling up on screen doesn't really help me a lot, because this thing should be a circle, and it is. But by default, radial gradients aren't circles. They're actually ellipses. So if I remove the circle declaration over here, you can obviously see what's going on. We have a radial gradient that's taking an ellipse shape. But circles are kind of nicer to look at, so I'm going to switch back, and I'm going to ask you to imagine that that's a circle. OK? Here's something else we can do with our circle. We can define a radius for the circle we have over there. So we can say like 300 pixels radius, and we get a circle which has a radius of 300 pixels. And if that doesn't look like it has a radius of 300, it's because we have this turquoise value over here at 50. If we're going to increase it slowly to 90, and then slowly, 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 eventually you're going to get your actual circle. But because previously you had just half of the circle, like a disk in the center for 50%, and then the rest of it is going to purple. And the way gradients work is that they're kind of infinite. They go to infinity and beyond, if you will. So my second color, it's going to start at whatever the previous one is, and it's going to extend to infinity unless I actually do something with the background image. And I'm going to look into that really soon. But here's something that happens with gradients if you increase them really close to 100%. So 99 is the magic number here. If you go to 100%, that just spills over into infinity and beyond. So you usually want to clamp it down to maybe 99%, or actually the magic value, 99.6. And this is how you get a nice circle done completely in CSS. No extra HTML elements, no pseudo elements, no border radius. You can also position this somewhere else. So right now it's placed at the center, but I can say at top left. So that's basically putting my center in the top left corner. But obviously it's clipped because it's putting the the center of that circle at that point. So we can actually add offset. So I can say add 300 pixels to the top offset, and then another 300 pixels to the bottom. So now we can position the circle in a different place. All right, so this was a quick introduction into linear and radial gradients. And here's a key bit of information that you're going to need for the rest of the presentation, is that even though we're working with colors over there, for the browser, CSS gradients are images and not colors. And this is very important here. This is key, because if CSS gradients are images, it means we can use all of the background properties with CSS gradients. And there's a bunch of them. I'm only going to look at background image, size, position, repeat, and origin in this presentation and show you some cool stuff you can do with that. So this, again, is a linear gradient. We have 120-degree slant over here. We can change it up and down. It goes from turquoise to 50% to purple again to 50%. Watch what happens when I change the background size of this. I actually get multiple gradients, and the background size has two values. The first one is the x value, and the second one is the y value, so width and height. So I can actually change the width or the height of this gradient up and down. And you're probably noticing that you're getting much more gradient than you actually want. And that's because by default in CSS, backgrounds repeat in both directions infinitely. But you can stop that using background repeat, no repeat. So now we've moved our background to the top over there. Let me just make it 50% so we can see it better. And we now have a isolated single layer in CSS. And we can also use background position to move it somewhere else. So I'm using background position center, center, and both two values. The first one is for the x value, second one is for the y value. You can actually change this to use, for example, a percentage value. So I'm going to say 10%, and then increase this value and move my layer around. Or I can change the background position to the vertical and say 100%. And this is kind of cool, because CSS really clamps the value for you. So when you're using background position, you don't have to give another offset. So 100% actually means it's going to stick to the bottom over there. All right. But so far, I've only been using one linear gradient declaration over here. And there's a very interesting thing about background properties in CSS. And that's the fact that you can have more than one. And this is another key piece of information over here. So that gradient I have at the top, I can rewrite it like this. So instead of having one single gradient, I can actually have two. One gradient that goes 120 degrees from turquoise to transparent, and another one which goes from transparent to purple. And I'm positioning them in such a way that they match exactly. And in reality, there are actually two layers over here. So if I click it and expand this layer, you can see that what we have here is actually two background images positioned so they look like one. And you can't have just, it's not only just multiple background images, you can have multiple background sizes. So each one of these gets its own property. So this scales them both to 100%. The first one is going to be on top. The second one is going to be at the bottom. And I can change the background size of the bottom one. Say, for example, let's reduce the vertical size and the horizontal. And I'll also do the same thing for the one at the top. And it's still two different layers that I'm messing about with over here and creating different shapes. I'm still working with CSS only. There's no extra HTML elements, no pseudo elements to achieve this. Of course, I can specify multiple background positions. They're both at the center, and I can have the first one be at the bottom, for example, and the second one at the top. And you can get some very nice effects just using these techniques. And obviously, you can repeat or not repeat the entire multiple background declaration. So this was the second piece, the second key bit of information, is that an element can actually have multiple background images, each with its own properties. I'm going to let that sink in for a while, because this is really, really important. What we're talking about here is actual layers in CSS, not having to use multiple HTML elements when you're doing decoration, because you can actually use multiple background images on a single element. So what can we do with this? Well, here's another example of having layers. And over here, I've added an extra layer with a radial gradient to the circle to the center, just to drive the point across that we have multiple declarations over here, and each one of them is independent. So for example, I can move that background position for that circle to be 100% in both directions, and that's going to clamp it to a different position, layers in CSS. All right. It's fair warning at this point that once you get this knowledge, you want to use it for a lot of things. And I am guilty of this as well, because once you find a new solution, you want to apply it to absolutely everything. But it may not always be the case. And in researching for this talk, I actually went into Behance, and I looked at some inspirational content like this. And I really love the backgrounds of this project, of this person. I'm sorry, I cannot pronounce his name. And I tried to replicate these things, but I actually hit a wall, because while you can do all of those individual backgrounds with what I just showed you, you can't actually clip them to different sizes in a single element. You would have to resort to multiple HTML elements or to pseudo elements, and that honestly just defeats the purpose. In that scenario, you might as well just use SVG. But that doesn't mean these aren't actually useful for something. So here's the article page of the Fast Company website. And notice that they have this nice, very yellow slanted background over there, which they're doing with SVG. But it can be done with CSS as well. So here's a solution for that. Over here, we have two background image declarations. First one is the yellow slanted background. So I can change the angle of this, so you see what's going on over here. And we have some yellow going from 60% and then to transparent. And at the bottom, I'm just having a very simple white gradient. And it's honestly just there so I can show you this. Because if you're going to go with a solid color throughout, you could just use background color for that thing anyway. But that's how you get the slanted background from Fast Company. Also on Fast Company, they have this thing in the article listings page where they have multiple shapes going on here. But what interests me here is the background, the slanted shape in the background over there. Again, we can do this with our CSS. And I'm just going to increase the colors here to gray, because I think that doesn't come across really well on screen. Yeah, there you go. So over here, again, we have two background images, two gradients at 185 degrees. The first one goes from transparent up to 20%. So we're basically reserving 20% of the image to be transparent, so you can see through it. You can see the white underneath. Then we're going to clamp the second value to gray, going to give another gray value so that it extends all the way to 80%, and then it's transparent again for the last 20%. And since we're using multiple backgrounds, we can actually change the position of this thing, of the background decoration over there. So I can move it up and down, left and right, and it gives you a lot more flexibility only from CSS without having to generate extra images. Though you could probably do this as an SVG. It really depends on what you want. And that's what we have, a layer created with just linear gradients over here. My initial question, can this be done with without an image? I'm sorry, I don't let go easily. So yes, I'm going to promote my answer. This is how you can achieve the same thing. What we have here is obviously a bunch of linear gradients, and they're stacked on top of each other. Each one goes from a shade of green to transparency, and they're all slanted at different values. So if I can turn this one off and just show you one of them, so I'm going to turn this one to red. That's my first gradient, and that's my second one, and so forth. And you can get really, really creative and just declaring your polygon background in one simple CSS declaration over there. All right. Patterns. Patterns are an amazing use case for this sort of thing, because you can do stuff like this. I'm using multiple radial gradients, and this is actually a pattern by Leah Veru. I'm just nicking it for a while. I'm going to change this one from red to black so it gets more clearly. So we have multiple radial gradients, but they're positioned in such a way so they overlap partially. And if I can explode this layer again, this is what you're going to see. We have repeating background gradients in both directions, positioned in such a way so you get that nice polka dot effect. And speaking of Leah Veru and of patterns, she actually has a very good collection of CSS patterns of all sorts of things done entirely in CSS gradients. And more recently, Bennett Feely created his own curation of patterns created with gradients, but he has an added twist. But he adds background blend modes to the mix. And this changes the way the colors interact with one another from a normal gradient. So you can get some really, really crazy effects like this. All right. Let's go into something more practical. Let's go into skeleton screens. And I'm not talking about those skeletons. I'm actually talking about this thing. I'm talking about progress indicators. We see them a lot nowadays. And the problem with progress indicators is that they emphasize too much on the indicator and not on the progress. So the thing with loading spinners is that you're made to look at a clock when you're actually expecting content. And then there's this emerging trend called skeleton screens that Facebook, Slack, and Medium are using at this point. So instead of just showing you a loading spinner while they're loading the content, they're actually generating some sort of mock UI, a false UI of creating the expectation that, hey, some of your content has loaded, but we can't show it to you yet. But they're demonstrating that there is progress going on in here. And you can say that's a bit misleading, and you'd be right. It's something different from a loading spinner, and it creates some sort of expectations that you will know where things are going to be positioned on screen. So how can we create skeleton screens with what we just learned previously? Well, by now, it's no big surprise. We can create a background image created of multiple linear or radial gradients. And over here, I have a radial gradient for that circle over there, and it's 50 pixels in radius, and I'm going to grow it and shrink it. Then we have a bunch of lines, which are the lines at the left there. I'm just going to change the color from light gray to, say, red, so you see what I'm talking about. Those are the lines, and which one of them is 20 pixels high. And then it goes to transparency, so you can see the lines underneath. Remember, these are all stacks. They're put on top of each other. That's why we need a transparency. And then we can vary their sizes with the background size property over here. So the first one here is the circle. The second declaration is the first line. The third one is the second line, and so forth. And of course, we have the background position, which offsets each one of these lines so they don't overlap with the circle over there, so you get this very nice effect. In a relatively small amount of code, we actually got a skeleton screen for a single element. But remember, we're talking about background images here. All background properties apply. Therefore, we can use the background repeat property, repeat y. So regardless of how tall or how small my element, I'm just going to get that repeated skeleton screen up and down. I don't have to actually create multiple instances if I don't have to. This is kind of cool. This isolates your entire skeleton screen in one CSS class, which cannot be touched by the outside if you're changing dimensions and properties to the outside, obviously not background properties. You don't have to use JavaScript to even toggle this thing, because this is CSS, you can use something like the empty pseudo class. So right now, my element there is empty, therefore it matches. So imagine you have a list, there's no content on it. When that selector matches, therefore the list is empty, you're going to get the background properties. As soon as you put content into it with JavaScript, this will no longer validate, and your skeleton screen automatically disappears. You don't even have to toggle a class name to lose this. And that's why it's valuable to have this in your toolset, because it reduces the amount of work you have to do while you're already doing a lot of work to pull in some content. Another thing which I kind of really wanted to show is that the Facebook loading screen has this nice shimmering effect going on top of it, and you can achieve it still in the same background element. So over here, the extra thing is another linear gradient, which is slanted, and it's semi-transparent in the middle. Let me just make it this different color so you can see what's going on over there. So I have this shimmering effect going from left to right, and I'm animating the position. I'm using a CSS animation here, lasting 1 second, and I'm moving the background position to 100% on the horizontal, so basically left to right. I can change this to 50%, and you're going to see it's like, you actually want it to go to 100% for the effect to be really nice. And this, again, is all inside of a single class name. No extra elements, no needless code on your screen. And of course, it works with background repeat as well, multiple shimmering effects. Which is kind of cool. All right, let's talk about borders. I don't have enough time to talk about all the things I want to show you, but here's borders. Borders in CSS are limited. You can't have multiple colors for the same border. You can't have a border which stretches only part way through the element. you can't easily move them around without messing up your layout. So if CSS borders are so limited, how did I achieve that? Well, I'm going to show. Here you go. Let's talk about gradient borders. The first thing you need to know about borders is that they create what's called the border box. And the border box is something that goes around the padding box, which in itself goes around the content. So you have content, padding, and then the border. And by default, backgrounds extend all the way to the padding border, but not to the border box. Sorry. Over here, you can probably see we have a background declaration of a linear gradient to white at the top, and something which looks like colors at the bottom, but we're not seeing any of it. It's actually there, and it's actually made to extend underneath the border over there with this property called background origin. So I'm setting the first one to be padding box, the white one, and the second one, which is the gradient, is the border box. But I have a border which is black. However, if I turn it to transparent, that background underneath it now shows. And this is very flexible because it's still a border. This is not a hack. I can increase the border size, and you're still going to get that nice gradient effect going up and down because we're using a background image. Since we're using a background image, we can obviously use the background positioning. So let's make the vertical one, let's reduce it to like 50%, the horizontal to like 50%, and now you can get really nice border effects. I can let's reduce the background position. Let's increase this to around 50%, so we're moving the border to the center over there, which is kind of cool. It gives you a lot more flexibility for using borders than you already have in CSS. And I'm just using one gradient over here. Obviously, you can use as many as you want to create this effect, and there's no need for extra nesting in HTML or pseudo elements and whatnot. And this thing, oh, I forgot to show you what's going on over here. So this kind of shows you that there's two layers. There's a white layer on top and the gradient layer at the bottom. The cool thing here is that it works with images as well. So instead of using a gradient, we can actually use just an image and again change the border size to change the way that image comes across from underneath the border over there. And the same thing applies. We have two layers. One of them is the white on top, so you get the elements padding and padding box to be white, and underneath you get the image over there. All right. That was a lot of things to cover in only 28 minutes. If there's only one thing I want you to go away with today is that CSS is very powerful, and there's a lot of features that you can use intelligently to achieve great effects. And there's one book I would recommend, and that's CSS Secrets by Leah Veru. It's by no means a book for beginners. You need to know a bit of CSS to take this on, but it will give you so many solutions to many of your problems, and a lot of the stuff you've seen today is inspired by stuff in Leah's book. It's definitely worthwhile to check this out for awesome solutions done completely in CSS and intelligently, not needlessly. So today we looked at CSS for decorations. There's a lot of properties you can use. There's a lot of great effects you can achieve. But if there's one thing I learned from building this presentation is the fact that CSS can get very complicated. Multiple gradients, multiple background images, working with all of them in code can get really cumbersome, and you have to introduce your own mental model of working with them. This is a space where a lot more tooling opportunity exists. I would love to see browser vendors bring updates into their dev tools to give you the possibility to create these things in your browser just by dragging and dropping, as opposed to writing so many layers by hand. And with that, my presentations for today is over. That's my Twitter handle up there. You can tweet me questions, and I'm going to answer them. I'm going to be around here today and tomorrow if you want to have a chat. All of these slides are posted at that URL over there, and I just tweeted a link to the entire slide deck and the source if you want to have a look. That's me. Thank you for listening, and enjoy Infoshare. Bye.